Many Christians today believe that Russia will play a major part in the end times because of an individual referred to as Gog of Magog. We find Gog mentioned in the 38th and 39th chapters of the book of Ezekiel, leading an invasion of Israel. There are two primary arguments put forward to place Gog at the head of the Russian army. First, Gog is said to be the leader of the nations of Magog, Meschech, and Tubal, and possibly a fourth nation named Rosh. Meschech and Tubal are believed by some to be Moscow and Tobolsk, the latter being a city in central Russia, while Magog and Rosh are often thought to be references to Russia as a whole. Gog is accompanied by a group of other nations, but I want to only focus on the ones that I have already mentioned, because Gog is said to specifically be the leader of them. Second, Gog of Magog is also said to come from the uttermost parts of the north in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. The prophet Daniel also mentions a king of the north who is said to invade Israel in the end times. Since Russia is to the far north of Israel, it is argued that this ruler from the north must be Russian. It is usually pointed out that Moscow is on an almost direct north-south line with Jerusalem. I want to use this video to explain why I am not convinced that Gog of Magog comes from Russia. I know this may not convince a lot of people, but I still want to put forward my arguments for others to see. Let me start with the nations of Meschech and Tubal. Ezekiel mentions these nations in two other places, chapter 27 and 32. In chapter 27, verse 13, Meschech and Tubal are seen as nations who trade with Tyre in modern-day Lebanon. Both passages locate them in the general area of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, not as far away as northern Russia or Siberia, as it is not believed that Tyre traded that far away at that time. This is supported by the ancient Assyrians who spoke about Meschech and Tubal in their records. What is very interesting is that the Assyrian records also couple Meschech and Tubal together, just like Ezekiel does. The Assyrians placed both of these nations in Anatolia, that is modern-day Turkey. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus locates Meschech in Anatolia as well. So two of the nations led by Gog do not seem to have anything to do with Russia, at least with records dating to roughly the same time as Ezekiel. What about Rosh? The Hebrew word here is, well, Rosh. This word is at the center of a huge controversy, as it has the general meaning of a chief, which is why we find Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 2 sometimes translated as Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meschech and Tubal. Many Bible scholars argue that the Hebrew grammar in this verse makes it more plausible to be a common noun rather than a proper noun. Others believe that Rosh is the name of a country. Thus, it could be translated as Gog of the land of Magog, prince of Rosh, Meschech, and Tubal. Because of this, some believe that Rosh should be seen as Russia. However, some scholars have noted that if Rosh is a nation, then it is better to equate it with a nation named Rashu, mentioned in Neo-Assyrian annals. Rashu was located on the border between Babylon and Elam, around the border between Iraq and Iran. It is also worth pointing out that identifying Rosh with Russia would be anachronistic, since the word Russia comes not from Rosh, but from the word Rus, which was not even brought into the region of Russia until the Middle Ages by the Vikings. In my opinion, Rosh should be interpreted as chief, or a nation in the Middle East. Russia is not the only option here, and doesn't fit the historical context of the passage. The identification of our last nation, Magog, is a bit more ambiguous. There have been primarily two major interpretations as to the location of the land of Magog. The first view identifies it with the Scythians, an ancient people known to have lived in an area stretching from Ukraine to western China. This view goes back at least as far as the ancient Jewish historian Josephus. The second view of the location of Magog argues that it is to be identified with the ancient nation of Lydia. Many scholars believe that Gog is likely a reference to the king of Lydia named Gyges. During the days of Ezekiel, Lydia made up what is today western Turkey. Gyges lived around the year 660 BC, and the Greeks referred to him as Tyrannos, or the tyrant. This, of course, does not mean that Gog was the same as Gyges. It is possible that the name Gog was used to give people in Ezekiel's day an example of the horrors of a future leader to come, similar to what we may say about a future dictator being another Hitler. The big problem with locating Magog is that neither of these interpretations has an airtight argument. Josephus doesn't tell us where the Scythians were located, and it is common knowledge that the Greeks viewed the Scythians as a people in modern Ukraine. However, Herodotus, who lived closer to the time of Ezekiel than Josephus did, placed the origins of the Scythians in present-day Turkey. Herodotus's identification of Magog with Anatolia is not an isolated case. Other ancient historians placed Magog in Turkey as well, including Pliny the Elder and Hippolytus of Rome, an early Christian theologian in the 3rd century. Pliny talks of an ancient city called Magog, near the border of Turkey and Syria. Although I can understand why someone wants to equate the Scythians with modern Russia, we must remember that the Scythians lived from Ukraine into Central Asia and Western China, and not just Russia. It is also possible that Gog may have nothing to do with Gyges of Lydia. A Russian identification of Magog is not impossible, but it is not the only interpretation that we have. Placing Magog in Turkey aligns very well with Meschech and Tubal being located in Turkey as well. The location of Magog is ambiguous, and both sides of the debate must proceed with caution, acknowledging that both have an argument to be made. A major part of the argument in favor of Gog being from Russia is that the names of the ancient nations sound similar to either Russia or places in Russia. For example, Meschech sounds like Moscow, Tubal sounds like Tobolsk, and Rosh seems similar to Russia. However, I have a problem with using similar sounding names to equate ancient and modern places. A good example is the ancient nation of Javan. One of Noah's grandsons was named Javan. This is the name translated as Greece in the Old Testament. However, Javan is very similar to the name Japan. Since they are so similar, I could therefore argue that Javan is not Greece, but Japan. It would be foolish for me to do so when contextual clues in Scripture equate Javan with Greece. I could also argue the same for the Scythians in Scotland. They are similar after all. We must be careful with names that sound similar and use the context to determine if they are the same or not. Another argument used in favor of Russia is ancient migrations. Bible scholar Leon Wood notes that Magog, Rosh, Meschech, and Tubal were all originally Middle Eastern peoples, but they eventually migrated into Russia. This argumentation concludes that because these nations eventually moved into Russia, then Russia is the place where Gog will come from. Once again, I see a problem with this. Gomer, another nation mentioned in Ezekiel 38 and 39, as following Gog into battle, was located in Anatolia, but some of his descendants moved into Europe. Does this mean that we should include Germany, Spain, and other European nations as part of Gog's coalition? Europeans eventually migrated to the Americas. Should the United States and Canada be included as well? Even many Hispanics have European ancestry. Should they be included in Gog's invasion because some of them are descended from Gomer? Cush and Put are also mentioned in Ezekiel 38 and 39. So should we include all of Africa since their descendants eventually migrated throughout the continent? Where do we stop? Should we just include most of the world in Gog's coalition? I think it is reasonable to understand why we shouldn't use migrations as a way to place Magog, Meschech, Tubal, and Rosh in Russia. I now want to tackle the title King of the North in the book of Daniel and the phrase the uttermost parts of the north found in Ezekiel. The King of the North is often used to argue that Russia will invade Israel at some point in the end times. Daniel uses the title King of the North earlier in the same chapter to refer to the ruler of the Seleucid Empire, the Greek kingdom headquartered in Syria. This is a problem for identifying the northern king as Russian, since there is nothing in Daniel chapter 11 to indicate that Daniel changes the location of the king of the north from Syria to Russia. A possible counter-argument is that the king of the north must be Russian because he travels through other countries on his way to Israel. A Syrian king, it is argued, would not go through many countries before reaching Israel. This means that the king of the north must be Russian, since a Russian king would go through many countries on his way to Israel. However, verse 40 seems to be referring to the three nations mentioned in verses 42 to 43. Egypt, Libya, and Nubia, that is modern-day Sudan. The point is that the king of the north will invade and conquer many countries. What is interesting is that Gog is said to come from the uttermost parts of the north. This is seen as proof that Gog comes from Russia. The expression from the remotest parts of the north appears 4 times in the book of Jeremiah and refers to Middle Eastern nations. Jeremiah 6:22 says, "Behold, a people is coming from the northland, and a great nation will be aroused from the remote parts of the earth." Because of the context, it is generally agreed that this is referring to Babylon. Notice that Babylon is said not only to come from the remotest parts of the earth, but also from the north. However, Babylon, which is in Iraq, is east of Israel. The answer seems to stem from the fact that Babylon had to invade Israel from the north. Invading from the east would be hard to do because the east of Israel is nothing but an inhospitable desert. Jeremiah chapter 50 verse 41 says, "Behold, a people is coming from the north, and a great nation and many kings will be aroused from the remotest parts of the earth." The context of this verse is dealing with God's judgment upon Babylon and the enemies that he will bring upon it. Although the invaders are not specified, there is mention of the kings of the Medes, who are in northern Iran, in the general context of the passage. Outside of Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, the phrase remotest parts of the earth is used in a geographical sense of nations in the Middle East, at least where we have enough evidence, thereby showing that the expression does not need to be taken to mean the furthest point away possible. Iraq and Iran were far away in the minds of ancient Israelites. To sum up my argument, there is nothing that demands that Gog of Magog will emerge from Russia. The nations that he rules over, Magog, Meschech, Tubal, and perhaps Rosh as well, fit the context of the Middle East, especially modern Turkey, much more than they do Russia. The mention that he will come from the far north does not rule out a Middle Eastern ruler either, as Babylon is considered as being from the north and far away as well. Russia is not a requirement for a fulfillment of these passages.